Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 119, Examining Embroidery, Seeing Stitches in Samples. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Take Up. I'm glad to have you here on this wonderful Friday afternoon to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, something that is constantly coming up in questions and commentary whenever I'm helping embroiderers make their way, especially digitizers who are trying to learn from other digitizers who are trying to learn from embroidery that's out there. Maybe they're doing what I like to call some retail research, which means we're looking at things that are on the high street, in the big box stores, in the fashion stores, online, and trying to figure out how they were made, how they were put together. And that is seeing stitches in samples. Now, there's also something to be said for some other versions of this. I talk about seeing stitches and developing an eye for embroidery in all of my classes. And that's often about how we learn to parse art, take art apart, and make it into stitches. And there's more to talk about there. And I actually have a links list this week, so I can show you some links to earlier sessions we did and some article stuff like that that has to do with the concept of design analysis. I mean, usually when I talk about design analysis, I'm telling you guys to go check out somebody's stock designs, maybe your own designs somebody has done for you, you've had a digitizer do things like measure stitch angle, stitch length, stitch types, watch the design run so you understand layering and sequencing. These are things that are very helpful to embroiderers and digitizers. However, sometimes we come across samples that are interesting to us that we can't do that with. We don't have access to the files. We don't have the original pieces. And when we don't have the original pieces, we are forced to make do with what the sample can show us. So I'm going to show some samples on screen at some point during this. We'll talk about the different samples that are there, and I'll show you what I'm looking for, as well as give you some of the kind of red herrings, some of the things that keep coming up in discussions that people say, hey, how do I achieve this? And it may not even be embroidery. We'll talk about that as well. But we're going to look at the different things we can look at in a sample piece, in an actual final embroidered piece, and what that can teach us and what we can learn and how we can apply that to our own work. So this is really kind of part of a continuum of different kinds of design analysis. You guys know that I love design analysis, but this is not just the analysis we would do on a stock design. This is what I would consider design analysis in the thread. Whether we are trying to gather some inspiration from a design that somebody else has done, or we have been contracted to replicate either a style or a particular design that someone else has created before us, we need to know what we're looking for so we can understand how things are created. Sometimes it can be that we're just not familiar with tools. It can also be that different softwares have different tools and different setups that may allow for things that our software does not. Depends on what software you're running. You can have things that are specific to software, but frequently we can replicate things that are in almost any embroidery you see. Now, I'll say this actually, if it really comes down to it, I can make the argument I always make, which is that embroidery machines as we know them, unless you're running a chenille machine, which is a different animal, a traditional embroidery machine is an interlock sewing machine. It can make one stitch. It makes a line of thread from one point to another that tends to be, between half a millimeter to 12.4 millimeters wide or long, depending on what you're talking about. One individual stitch is long, not wide, satin stitch column width. And those stitches are stacked together to make other kinds of combinations of stitches that we call stitch types. So if you really wanted to, you can use the manual stitch tool in any digitizing software to replicate any embroidery you've ever seen that was done on a similar machine. However, it is good to know what stitch types are. It is good to know how those are put together. Thing is, we can replicate anything if we want to take the time to do it. And sometimes what you're going to find very frequently when I have somebody ask me, hey, how is this put together? Here's this sample. What happened here? How did someone make this stitch type? What they're often doing, and I'll just be patently honest with this, they're looking for me to tell them how an area of stitches was broken down as one big fill area, and what can I apply some sort of automated process to make a stitch type happen, when the person who did the digitizing of this original piece either went to a great deal of trouble to digitize something manually, either stitch by stitch or in individual blocks, more blocks than it looks like they have, like many pieces that were coming together to make a whole, or that they have made something like a custom motif, something that I showed pretty recently, episode 112, which I'm going to discuss a little bit here today. A custom motif along a path that they filled an area in, but what looks like an area, an object in the design, is actually multiple objects or a path on which they used a custom motif, a custom fill type to make the thing happen. So Part of the problem is that we have to get out of our heads the concept that the shape we see in front of us, whether we're talking about digitizing from art, this is also true, or we're talking about the sample that's in front of us, that the shape we see, the outline of the block of color we see, is the shape that somebody drew in our digitizing software. That's the first problem. Because we can have a shape that's in our evident art that was actually made up of multiple paths or shapes that were drawn in digitizing software, and that we've filled them with stitches that mesh together in such a way that it looks continuous, but it might not have been drawn that way, and the tools may not have been applied to a continuous single edged shape or single border. It's one of the things we have to realize. The shapes that we're looking at are very rarely the shapes that were drawn to make them happen, almost never. And the next thing to remember is that not everything is automated, and sometimes the hard but very true answer is that someone with time and dedication took the initiative to draw out something individually in either manual stitches or straight stitches or smaller individual blocks that are difficult and time consuming to draw, to make a piece instead of creating something that was automated. So, like I said, I'll bring up the thumbnail one more time to kind of discuss this. I have a few examples up here that kind of are part of this. This is some pieces of mine, honestly. I put pieces of mine in one little retail piece up here so I can tear up my own art, which is part of what I'll do, as well as showing you guys some stuff from the retail catalog and just some random stuff as we come across it. I'm going to take this as a fairly loose kind of episode, but I'll show you some of these things and say, here's what I'm looking for to tell me how I might break down a piece and say, what are these pieces made of? Because I cannot tell you how many times somebody will send me a piece, or I'll be in one of my groups, one of my various Facebook or embroidery groups or Instagram threads, where somebody asks a question about a piece that they've seen, and the question and answer session is always about how do I achieve this in my own software, and frequently that really boils down to, hey, what stitch types were used here, and ultimately they think it's a stitch type applied to a shape. More often than not, what we're looking at is something where there's some manual intervention, some custom stitch types applied to it, or multiple shapes that are brought together to make the final piece. So we'll talk about that stuff, and I'll actually discuss some different things that I saw in the last week and questions that were asked of me to describe some of the stuff that's happening. But before I get too far into that, let's go ahead and get some comments for folks. We always like to say hi to everybody who shows up today. So if you're here, you are live. You are part of the live streaming crew. Hey, love you guys who are on replay. If you're watching this on replay, please ask your questions. However, if you are here during the time that I'm recording, during the time that I'm going live, you get a chance to have your question asked and to say hi to me directly. And if you want to ask a question or share your experiences with analyzing designs or trying to figure stuff out, or what you did figure out, or pieces you've put together that kind of fit into the general idea of the stuff we're talking about today, by all means, jump in on the comments, ask your questions, give your insights, and you may become part of the show. In any case, let's say hi to the folks who are here saying hi. First, we have Barb saying, good afternoon from sunny North Central Minnesota. Glad it's sunny up there and that you're having a good time. Hi, happy to have you in, Barb. Frank down from the UK, who is always sharing great information. Thank you for being here, Frank. Good evening to you. Ramona is in saying afternoon. Good afternoon, Ramona. Always teaching, doing great stuff, and has her own show, Coffee and Conversation, tomorrow. So you might want to check in on what she's talking about. I believe tomorrow is fabrics, which is always a good topic to have. We have the interaction with materials that happens with embroidery is always a big deal. We should really learn that stuff. So go check out her channels as well. Sally Davies is in saying good evening. Cindy is late, but here. Happy to have you, Cindy. Lisa Shaw says she is saying good afternoon, but hopes the storm doesn't kick her off. I hope it doesn't kick you off either up there in Elbert, Colorado. So hopefully you're doing okay. And we have Joanne saying hello from Ohio. Hello. And we have Melanie saying hi. Hi, Melanie. Happy to have you in as well. And Joanne just got done her own live show, so I guess check out what Joanne's doing too. Suffice it to say, a lot of us doing lots of cool stuff. And like I said, Ramona prepping fabrics as we speak or listen. Yeah, no, we are all prepping stuff and we're all teaching. So all of you guys who are reciprocators and giving back, love it. Love it. Love to have you guys here and happy that you're in. And Jeff, of course, getting prepped for Applegate Getaway. Jeff Fuller and Adam also getting in here too. And Cindy saying hi from Sacramento. All right. I will try and jump into the actual topic we have at hand. I know some people don't love the hellos, but I do. So we're going to keep doing them. Love to say hi to everybody and have people going on with it. So yeah, Ramona, everybody's saying they'd like to watch your show. Go ahead and share that in the comments. Share the link for everybody to check that out. This is both a live show and a recorded show. I like the live interaction, but I also love when you guys come with commentary, especially the biting commentary about what we're actually talking about. So let's talk about it, right? Seeing stitches in samples. What are we discussing here? First thing I'm going to say, we do have a links list, and I'll go ahead and let you know. This is the links list. I will copy this and put this in the commentary for everybody who is here live or who is checking in later. You can go ahead and click on that. But at this links list, what we have are a couple of episodes of the Take Up that are pertinent to what we're talking about, design analysis. We have the Take Up episode 23, applying machine embroidery analysis to digitizing your own designs. So very similar kind of thing that we're talking about today, just not as much about doing it in the thread. And we have 107, getting design information and machine embroidery technique analysis too. So part of it is about informational workflow, but the second half is about analyzing techniques. So that's what's going on here, folks. That is also in the links list. So if you want to check out a couple of other episodes, you have some more work you want to do, and you've got to have something to listen to while you're doing it, by all means, grab that link and you'll be able to listen to more episodes that kind of cover the same sort of topics that we're going to cover today. So let's get to it, right? Design analysis in the thread, or seeing stitches and samples. If you are someone like me who does things like go to the shops, go to the high stores, go check out fashion stuff, go check out streetwear, and take a look at the designs that are in front of you, you know that sometimes we have to have a little bit of imagination if we want to get inspired by these pieces. We need to be able to understand what we're looking at as far as seeing samples, analyzing what's there, and knowing how they were put together. And the first thing I'm going to say about this is, if you are going to be able to do this kind of analysis, you're going to have to kind of consume a lot of embroidery. And what this means to me is not that you need to be constantly on channels like mine listening to what I talk about, is that you need to literally look at a lot of embroidery and spend some time both in your software and looking at other people's work to understand how certain stitches are built, how they're laid down. Because part of what I'm going to tell you guys is that, yes, there are things we can look at, but ultimately, when we're trying to make the translation between what we're seeing in front of us and the tools that are in digitizing software, we will have to know what our individual software does and how it does it. So, without going too far into it, because that's not really the thrust of what we're doing today, I will say this: you need to know kind of your big three, big four. We talk about these in different ways. The big four stitch types. We need to know running stitches or straight stitches. We need to know manual stitches. We should know how fill stitches or tatami stitches work in our software and how satin stitches work in our software. Those are the big four. Those are absolutely critical. You need to know what they look like and how they are drawn and how they kind of perform in your software. It will help you to understand how they're built. Certainly, I would go further and say things like motif stitches. So when we have a repeated motif, a repeated group of stitching that goes along a path, motif stitches, whether they're custom motifs or motifs that are programmed into your software, that's important to understand, to know the difference between those kinds of things and how they look, how they operate, how you draw them. I think that's important to understand a little bit about motifs and to know what it looks like when something is done manually. So we need to know kind of the different sort of variables that go into those. We need to understand that a straight stitch tends to have a uniform length along a path so that it drops a needle point along a path at set intervals. That's how a straight stitch looks. We need to know that if we see two layers of that back to back on top of each other, it's only two passes. That's probably just one line of straight stitch doubled. We should know what a bean stitch or a repeated count stitch is, where you see a stitch that is very thick looking, but it looks like multiple passes of thread are on each stitch. We have multiple passes where we're using the same stitch penetration points. They'll be generally in odd numbers as they travel forward through the design. We should kind of know what those things look like in general. It's going to help us understand what these things are. So what I would say is, if you haven't had this time to work on these things yourself already, stop at some point, look at your software, say what sort of stitch types are there, and if you can, literally stitch some samples. And not if you can, take some time. If you have access to a machine and the software that you're digitizing with, you need to take a look at some of the basic stitch types that are in your software, build some blocks of stitches and stitch some samples. At, at the very least, we should be looking at designs that other people create and run them off to see what they look like. Some of those basic stitch types are going to be things we can talk about here. I certainly have done stitch type episodes, which I should have thrown on the links list. But if you're over on YouTube, you're over on Facebook, and you search for stitch types Eric Gamble, or you're in the take up area and you look for stitch types, you will see me talking about different stitch types that exist out there and motif stitches, things like that. You should know a little bit about what we're talking about as far as that in order to do the analysis. I'm still going to talk about how we do the analysis and how I get there. So if you don't feel like you know that, you still have something we can talk about today that'll be valuable to you. However, I do want you to think about these things and say basic stitch types. We need to know what they look like in our software and how they operate, because understanding how the shapes operate, how the software operates in this case, will help us see where people have broken things apart, how we parsed a design, how we drew the shapes that we need in order to create them in the samples. So basic stitch types are necessary to check out, and I think it's very much useful to understand. So basic stitch types, you should know these. So when we're trying to see stitches in samples, if we don't know our basic stitch types, we're going to have a hard time understanding what we're looking at. So certainly go back if you haven't checked that out. Certainly I've got a couple of episodes that talk about stitch types. Go look at those and see what we're talking about, and you'll understand what those are. So for sure, if you're looking at logo type work, you're going to see a lot of straight stitch, satin stitch, fill stitch. Those are going to be very common to you, and you're going to understand those. Fill stitch generally tends to be fairly regular, big flat areas. Satin stitch, columns and text, where we see turning stitch angles whenever we go through a rotated shape like a letter O. Straight stitch, whenever we see lines of stitches that have a regular break point to them, a regular length, generally regular. They're going to get shorter inside of curves, especially on short curves. Those things are things you should be able to pick out or at least understand how they look. Secondarily, bean stitches, motif stitches, things like back stitches, so other variations on the straight stitch or motif stitch are going to be very valuable to understand. And if nothing else, we will also be looking at some different kinds of looks that we achieve that will let us know when we aren't using these standard stock stitches. So that's something we should look at. We want to consume embroidery and really look at things in the thread. So not only am I saying we're going to talk about how you see stitches and samples, you need to look at sample material. When you are out, if you're looking at anything that is fashion or decorated, or you're seeing promotional products in the wild, you should be looking at the pieces and wondering about what is going on with these. And you need to do that pretty widely. The great thing is, right now, you can go and look up embroidery or embroidered patch and any topic, any art style in the world on Google, and look at the higher resolution images. Go to tools under your image search and look for high for the high resolution images, and zoom in, and we can see a lot of this without even being present for it. We can see a lot of this in scans and high resolution photos. But we want to look at samples and we want to consume embroidery. It just makes the most sense to understand. If we want to know more about embroidery, we have to look at a lot of it. And the more of it we look at, and especially the more of it we kind of look at and work on in our own software to try and replicate, the more we'll be able to understand how things are put together. So, like I said, seeing stitches samples, designing or design analysis in the thread, it starts, of course, with looking at a lot of embroidery. What I'm going to do then is just bring up, I'm going to have a gallery where we'll start talking about some things that are in the thread, and we'll discuss some of the things that are there. And also, I'm going to share some other samples, some things that are interesting for people. And like I said, talk about a couple of examples that came up in the last week that were things people asked me about, where I could talk about, hey, how is this put together? And especially when it's something that's non-standard, that doesn't look like every other piece of embroidery. And as we go further, if there's some questions or people have some commentary or things that they want to talk about, we will go ahead and let that go afield if we want to. But for right now, I've got some samples that we'll discuss that are, real world samples and real questions that people brought to me in the last couple of weeks. But first, let's just go ahead and throw this up on the stream. I do have a gallery of some things to take a look at. A lot of them are my own work, and we'll talk about some of the standard work. We've got some retail research stuff that I have uh, from different kinds of pieces I've taken pictures of. Like I said, I am terrible about taking pictures in stores. If I am ever in a like a mall store, a clothing store, a fashion store, a streetwear store, or if I'm in the airport and I see anything that looks like embroidered gear in any of these souvenir shops, you better believe I'm there taking pictures of it, because all of this stuff is grist for the mill. It's inspiration for me to look at the way people are executing embroidery, the way people are making marks, and how I might decide to make different marks myself, and how to fill areas with color, fill areas with shapes and texture. It's something we're always looking at. But as we look at some of these pieces and some of the other pieces that I have saved out that aren't in this gallery, I'm going to talk with you guys about texture. I'm going to talk with you guys about how you can tell things are put together. And actually, the first thing I want to do, though, is share something interesting that came out of one of you guys, one of the viewers. Earlier on, I talked about making textured fills. And this is something I'm going to talk about in a second. You see this piece here, this in the middle that has this kind of Viking helmet. This is one that came up in one of the embroidery groups that I belong to, the Stitch Artist group, where we talked about how this piece was made. And I'm going to discuss this more, but it's got a really cool, interesting textured motif that's being used to fill it. I'll talk about how I analyze that and what I think it is. And by the way, if you're the creator of this piece, by all means, let me know if I'm wrong about how this is put together, because I could be wrong. I'm just doing the best job I can from what I can see, and we'll talk about that. But when we looked at this piece here, the question was, how did this get put together? What was this done for? How did this work? And the initial comment a lot of people had was like, all right, this is probably a fill. We're doing two different types of fill on top of each other. We have these different textures going on. But because I had very recently talked about this, and it's something that I've discussed with people many times, many times over before we got to this piece, I said, all right, no, I don't think this is just a type of fill. And I'm going to show you some different things that we can look at to analyze that. And then I'm going to show you, like I said, a very lovely piece that's actually over here that is from one of our viewers, and we'll talk about that in just a second. They actually went to one of the techniques that I shared on the show and made something cool. But let's start with this piece. So we're looking at this particular piece here, and let's do some live analysis, and we'll talk about how we get there, right? And I'm going to be honest and say I could be wrong. Like I said before, I could totally be wrong about how this is put together, but here are the things I'm looking at. I'm looking at this piece and everybody's saying, all right, this could be a couple different fills put together, but there are some things that make me feel like, you know what, this is not just one big fill shape around the R, and that the R is then just filled with a couple of different textures of tatami fill. Why? Well, if we think about different types of tatami fill, what does a tatami fill look like? What does a fill stitch look like? It can be curved. We can have curved fill stitches, which I can show you more of later. In fact, I'll go ahead and back this up and show you just some standard fill stitches and some curved fill stitches. In this case, here's a piece that has both. This is a standard fill stitch in the back of this horse. It only has one stitch angle, right? The angle doesn't turn. The direction that I'm drawing with my cursor here is the stitch angle. That's the nominal angle of the fill. That's the angle that the threads are laying on. If we look at the neck of the horse, it has a curved fill. It's still only really one angle. And you can have, there are also fills called a Florentine fill in Wilcom, which is different. These were done in Stitch Artist. In Stitch Artist, this just is a straight fill and a curved fill. In Wilcom, I've done fills that are Florentine, which can have a curve on the top and the bottom so that we kind of have different densities as we match a curve at the top and we travel through different curves until we hit a curve at the bottom. And we can get two curves together to make a Florentine fill. But these fills essentially have one angle or one curve that this thread is following. How can I tell it's a fill stitch? Well, I've got a repeated offset fill. I have a pattern of threads where generally the points are offset from row to row, and it's made to fill this piece. It's usually regular. You can use randomness to make it rougher, but it's made to fill a large area. It doesn't line up. Unlike the satins here, we don't have the same stitch length that lines up where all the penetration points line up in the same at the same edge point. We don't have any rippling that we would have from either split satins, or we could have a fill where everything lines up on certain rows. This is a fairly standard offset fill stitch, right? So offset points so that we don't have any one place where the penetration points line up to create texture. But we do have in this neck, we have a curve. Well, if I go back to the piece that we were just looking at, I'm going to look at this and say, I don't see the regularity here. So what are the kinds of things that I'm looking at? So we're trying to determine stitch type on this piece. First thing I can tell you is I don't see any traditional stitch types that we usually talk about. There is no traditional satin being used here because I don't have a nice shiny sheen. I don't have an unbroken sheen with lined up edges. I don't have the kind of shapes that are common to satin stitch, right? All right, so we're talking about stitch types. I don't have satin stitch. I don't have tatami stitch. Why? Well, if I'm looking at a tatami or a fill stitch, I'm going to have more regularity. So one of the things that we're going to look for in this is regularity. Does this have regularity in the stitch? Yes, to a degree, but it's not as regular as smooth as a standard tatami or fill stitch would be. Also, I'm going to tell you I'm seeing some textures here that are interesting. So I'm talking about some textures that were interesting in this piece. Well, if we kind of zoom down here, we look over at this helmet, I can see a pattern that's forming and we can see some repetition. So this is where I'm going to talk about what I think it's made out of. If we're seeing repetition in these patterns, right? And I think it's actually more visible up here in these pieces. We're occasionally seeing this repeated little zigzag here. We see it up here in the top of the S, and we're seeing it repeat on paths. So when I look at this piece, I'm saying, all right, I've got some interesting textures. I can see that we've got a repetition of some kind. It looks like we're repeating a block of stitches every so often, but when I'm looking at this piece, what I can say is it looks like we're filling this in a different way. It looks like we're filling this with a spiral. Depending on your software, you may have a spiral fill that will allow you to fill an area with a spiral path. And since we're on a path, and what I mean by being on a path right now, that means that I have a path through the design, a line that is being traced along inside of the design. In this case, I believe I'm seeing a spiral path. It's either spirals or contours. Contours being like inset multiple shapes that kind of shrink down toward the center of this overall shape, or a spiral path where it's starting in the center and very much like a contour but connected, moving all around until we get to the outside edge of the shape. To me, to the best of my knowledge, just looking randomly at this piece, not spending a lot of time on it, but taking a look at this piece, I'm going to say, all right, I'm seeing some repetition. I have an interesting texture here. By the way, the texture is not super regular, so I'm going to say it's very likely a custom motif of some kind. And this repetition is regular, but it is following a path, following a regular direction, a set of paths that are going around in a shape to fill this area. And I think you see that throughout the piece, all the way around in this outer horn, too, has a very contour like path. There are also these repeated paths that are going around inside of these letters. So I see these paths that are going on, and it looks like there may also be an edge kind of finishing stitch that's going on, or that very consciously the person who's done this has done a good job of kind of lining up the motif so that there is an edge to the actual piece. So what am I seeing for this one? I'm going to say this is very likely a custom motif of some kind that is following a spiral path that fills this area. The motif is wide enough that we have some overlapping so that we get full coverage. So one of the things we can talk about here is also, do we have a lot of show through? Maybe a little bit, but not too much. It's possible they have a fill or some other underlay underneath it that is helping with some of the coverage. It's something that I did in my own piece on episode 112, where I talked about a very similar piece like this, and they may have some sort of fill that's in there covering it, but each one of these areas, it looks like we've got some sort of motif that is covering that piece, and it looks like it's following a set of paths, which is giving this kind of interesting ridged texture and this kind of spiralized shape here. So when I'm looking at this piece, I'm saying, all right, how is this being achieved? Very likely, or at least how would I achieve it? I'm probably going to make some sort of custom motif that follows a path like this. And whether I do this in my digitizing software or I go from the vector software when I'm preparing my art, I'm going to make some sort of spiral path that has spacing between each row of the spiral that is some percentage of the space of my motif so that when they overlap, I get a solid fill. Right? So that's where I go about it. So if you're wondering, how do you do this analysis? What am I looking for? I'm looking for these different kinds of pieces that show me how I'm going to parse it. I'm looking for the stitch type. In this case, it's a novel stitch type, very likely a custom motif because it's nothing that you're going to find under your satin path that's built into your software, not very likely. In this case, stitch angle, we got all kinds of different angles. This tells me that it's probably something custom or that it's layered with multiple angles. Stitch length, that's something we might be able to measure if we have this thing on hand. In this case, it looks like multiple lengths because we have a kind of rough, organic looking texture. But the shape and the parsing is where it gets interesting. Parsing means how we put this in different pieces. And in this case, when I'm looking at the shapes that are here, I don't think we just have one area that we're necessarily filling unless we're using a spiral fill in our software. It might be that we're creating the spiral path instead. Otherwise, we're using some sort of spiral fill. Maybe it is one piece, but it doesn't necessarily have to be for it to work. We might be using a path to fill the area and we're using a motif to follow the path. If I look at layering, I would say it's possible, depending on how this is put together, that we are layering multiple like paths out from the center. That's kind of layering. But usually when I'm talking about layering, I'm talking about which thing is on top, which color is on top of what, which object is on top of what. That's a little different. But I'm definitely looking at things like repetition, texture, spacing, and show through. That's how I'm trying to figure out how these pieces are done. And this is a fairly extreme case. This is not a very standard piece. This piece was done by someone who's making a very cool texture, using something that's non-standard, doing something very much like I said I did in episode 112, where we're using our tools in a novel way to create an interesting texture. So I think that's pretty interesting, right? That's what I like about that. It's a very interesting piece. I see why they wanted to replicate it because it's pretty cool. It's something that you might want to replicate yourself. And if you did, I would start looking at how can I fill an area with that spiral path and how can I place stitches along that path that are going to give me that kind of interesting texture. Why I bring back, I keep talking about episode 112. I'll actually show, I didn't have the other sample of the piece that I have here, which I may have to grab that real quick myself just to get it for you guys. But we had a sample where I essentially used stipple stitching. I used stippling and actually I'll grab this sample so we can see it real quick. I used a stipple inside of a shape and then did a custom rough motif and overlapped it with the stipple stitching in order to create a fill. Because this is a piece where I actually did just draw this outside shape. So all I have is a Pro Block style G here, where I filled it with a quilting stipple style that was spaced far enough apart that when I then turned the path of the stippling into a custom motif run, so a run stitch that follows the stippling path, I applied a custom motif to it that was rough and had different kind of stitch angles all over the place. And as it filled through that stippling motif, we got a fill like this. And eventually I actually used a light mesh fill and underlay underneath it to get some better coverage. But that's something that I did in that previous show. That was episode 112. And in that piece, you can see what I did. I used a fill type that is not a standard tatami fill. It's not a standard satin stitches, nothing like that. It was me using a path, the stippling path. So I did use a stipple fill setting, and then I applied a custom motif to it. When we're looking at something like this, we have to say, how can I fill the space with a similar kind of stitch to make this happen, right? So that's what I'm saying. Depends on how you're working with it, and it depends on what kind of tools you have. But if we look at it and say, I've got randomized coverage, the angles aren't all the same, this is likely something that's not going to be done in a standard fill or a mesh or multiple layers of fill because the directions would be too regular. The most likely candidate for that is a custom motif or a set of custom motifs or layered stitches. This could also be done entirely manually, but it's not likely that most people are spending that kind of time. And when we see things, even in my piece, you'll see on this edge, we see the repetition that's happening on this edge. We can see that repetition that keeps happening along the edge. Then you think to yourself, that is a custom motif, like a stamp, as if I were stamping it along a line that is repeating along a path. And we can see this repeated little stitch sticking out in multiple areas along the piece. And that helps us understand what we're looking at. Like I said, that's a higher level version of this stuff. Most of the time, we don't have something that is this high level, that is going to be this different than a standard design. Most of the time, we're going to find things that are produced with the normal stitches that we have as the basic 4 kind of major stitches in our palette. So most of the time, we're not going to have something this crazy. What I do want to show you is something really cool that was actually done by one of the viewers who saw episode 112. This is Sebastian Vasquez. And Sebastian Vasquez made this. And I wanted to show you really quickly because I thought this is interesting. This was made with that same type of technique I showed you guys from episode 112, and it was finished with a nice big satin border to make it smooth along the edges. However, what you're going to see here that's interesting, this is where you might get thrown for a loop. You see how these colors are appearing in different places all over the place. The first thing somebody would tell you, I know a lot of people would say, all right, so it must be like 3 or 4 layers of color that are done in here. So they did some spacing and they added more motif stitches. And the cool thing is this one, I'm going to show you how I can tell it's not. And also I know because first thing Sebastian told me it's not. So Sebastian said it's not that they did a variegated thread, right? But when we talk about this piece, we can actually see, of course, how can I tell it's variegated thread and not multiple layers of the same stamped motif in thread? Is though we see some whole motifs in one color, if we go over here down to this bottom corner, we see that there's a couple of single stitches or a few stitches, maybe 5 to 10 stitches out of a motif that are in a color during a transition. And when we see just a few stitches of that one color attached directly to another color, or if on an individual stitch, sometimes you will catch on an individual stitch that we've transitioned from one color to another, then we know that was done with a variegated thread. So in this case, we have this really cool variegated thread. And because of the randomized nature of all those different stitch angles in the motif, we get a very kind of splotchy random look to the final piece. So very cool thing. So thank you, Sebastian Vasquez, for sharing that piece with me and showing it to me. Approached me on Instagram and showed me the piece after seeing the episode 112. But that's another thing where you can analyze that and say, all right, custom motif. It was done on some sort of path. It doesn't have that spiral look that is very, very regular. So you can tell yourself, all right, it's probably not spirals or contours because the lines are not exact, though the edge line is pretty exact. And you'd say, all right, what is a randomized path you can use to fill the inside of a design? And a good call for that is probably stippling. Quilt stippling tends to be fairly random, and there's multiple patterns involved as a possible starting point. So quilt stippling plus a custom motif run equals something randomized like this that doesn't take a tremendous amount of time to achieve. And of course, the satin stitch outline edge is easy to tell because it has the classic hallmarks of satin stitch. So like I said, These are the kind of things we're looking for. But when we're looking at other designs, we can still get those same kind of cues. And part of the issue is understanding what we're looking for, understanding what we're looking at, and realizing how we might get that in our software. And I think that's part of the thing. Even on a simple design, we can do simple analysis that helps us. If you have a design like this, is a piece of mine where I did a really large single color piece on a dad hat. So this thing's huge, it's like 3 inches tall, goes way up into the crown. But on a single color like this, I'm not having registration issues or anything else like that because I don't have multiple colors that are coming together. However, it's pretty easy to see how this was put together. Lots of people I know who, when they first start working on digitizing, they want to take a big vector shape, like let's say this gear shape or this skull shape, and they essentially want to slap one stitch type on the entire thing. They say start at the bottom, end at the top, fill the whole shape, and we're done. Usually, when they do that, they end up with kind of substandard results, or they're going to look at that and say, man, this looks flat. That doesn't look this good. It was inefficient on the machine. I don't know why it has to look like this. And then they go look at a piece like this piece, even though this is a very simple, not very sophisticated piece that I did, and say, why does this look different? How is it done? What's the deal with that? And this is what I talked about earlier, where they often just don't parse the design, they don't break the design up into several pieces. They often take the pieces that come directly out of an SVG file or EPS file, whatever it is, or they auto trace a design, and they jam the pieces in there, put one stitch type, entry, exit, one angle, and go, and hit Tatami fill, and they end up with kind of a fairly lackluster piece. Or they wonder, why can't I get this piece to look like that? Because what they have when they bring in their vector art into the software is, let's say, this unbroken gear shape, one big shape, and they cannot manipulate that shape in any way or add a stitch type to that shape in any way that looks like the result that they're seeing online or that they're seeing in the thread. Well, that's when we have to start looking at things like parsing. What am I talking about parsing? When I talk about shape or parsing, I'm saying, how did this design get redrawn? How is it put back together? And where did they decide to do that parsing? How did they make those separations? And in this case, if we look at this design, the first thing we're going to do is look at our stitch types and our stitch angles to tell what's going on. Number one, we know that tatami fills are only going to have one stitch angle generally. Even if it's a curve, it's usually one curvature. You may be able to argue for a Florentine fill for this center piece, but what you can already tell is in the center of the skull, I've got two tatami fills for the top and bottom area that are done with curved fills. So curved fill stitches, top and bottom. How can I tell? I can see the nominal curve from the way these stitches are lying. It is obviously a fill, a normal offset texture fill. It's not a rough or randomized texture, so I know that we are probably using a fairly default texture. We could measure the stitch length if we want to in the piece, but that might be something we just have to learn from the textures that we have or use our own defaults and play with it. But we can see we've got these curved fills, top and bottom. We can see that obviously that the eyebrow pieces here, they are not touching, so they're not contiguous. So those are different shapes. That they have different angles. This is a rotating kind of a fill angle that turns with the satin. So this stitch angle turns with the satin. So we know we've got two blocks here, and very likely we have two blocks here for the two cheekbones. What does this mean? The only important thing that it means is I have drawn at least 6 shapes to make the skull portion. How can we tell? Because I've got different stitch angles, different stitch types, and we know we can't assign multiple types to the same stitches. This one's pretty obvious because of the satin stitches. Same thing here. Even if these were smooth, we would be able to tell because of this shadowed line in the gear that the ring of the gear is separate from the teeth in the gear. First things we're going to see about this, these are tatami stitches. These are fill stitches. Why in each of these teeth we see we have offset penetration points that are not, they are regular, but they're not big and shiny. There are not the rippled texture you would have from multiple fills stacked or multiple satins stacked next to each other. They look smooth, flat, shiny, and regular. These are generally going to be fill stitches. Also, each one of the teeth has a different stitch angle, so this is not one big connected piece. It could technically be a connected piece that has a rotating fill, a radial fill through it, but because these are separated by some space and they're underneath the top layer of the satin stitch border, the likelihood is they are not connected, they are traveled between, and so these are individual fill blocks. So each one of these teeth is one little drawn block, and we have a regular width satin stitch border here being used for the inside of the gear, for the ring in the gear. We can tell it's on top of the fill, literally, because it's layered that way. So we're looking at layering as well. So what we know is We're going to be drawing these individual teeth. Very likely they're copied and pasted and rotated along one piece because the teeth are regular. They're all of the same shape. But we can use either any sort of column stitch tool. We would draw the inner and outer edges, or we use the ladders type entry tool where we set our width each time. Or because we can measure or even just take an eyeball to this ring around this gear and say it's the same width all the way around, we can use any of the satin stitch border tools that have a single line entry and have a single width satin that goes around the entire piece. So immediately, yes, this is a very simple design, but you can see how it works. We look at our stitch types, we look at where the angles are, we look at how the shape is put together and parsed, and we see a lot of that via layering. So layering and through our texture. Other things we can tell about this piece, I'm not seeing a lot of show through. So the likelihood is if this is 40 weight thread, and I can generally tell from looking at the texture of the thread, and this is kind of a materials question, how thick does a thread look? Does it look like standard thread? I can tell that we probably have fairly standard densities here. I would wager that we're in the 0.4 to 0.45 region, or the 4 to 4.5 embroidery point region of density in our both our fills and satin stitches around this piece. Could they be a little higher, a little lower? Yes, but I know we're probably in the ballpark because with 40 weight thread, I'm not seeing a bunch of show through with this much contrast, which means I'm not probably running anything lighter than that. And I might be able to see some underlay on this piece. I know it's got some tatami underlay. If I looked at the piece very closely, I'd probably see it. But if not, then it's up to my kind of judgment what kind of underlay I would use, depending on the things I know about embroidery in general. However, this piece is easy for me to reproduce now. I know how to reproduce a piece like this or make a similar piece. I would highlight any of the kind of areas that make sense for satin stitches, like ridges on the eyebrow, ridges in the cheekbone. I can highlight this very regular piece because it's like a gear is actually put together, where if you laid a gear on the table or a sprocket on the table that had a raised rib and teeth, the teeth are further back away from us than that ring, then the teeth would go first and we layer the ring on top, and we would have those two different textures for some textural contrast. Fill is going to be flatter, satin is going to sit up higher and be shinier. So we have those kind of textures. We can use those to represent the real shapes in the actual piece, but it's fairly easy to pull that out of the actual design. So when we look at the design, we can see what we're looking at. We get an idea of how it's being drawn and how it's being put together. I know that which shapes had to be drawn to make that happen. Not all pieces are going to be that easy to analyze, but that piece is fairly easy. I mean, and most of the pieces we see are fairly easy. We can look for these kind of cues to let us know, am I looking at something that's very regular? Am I looking at something that has repetition? Am I looking at something where the regularity tells me that it is one stitch type with one setting that is carried through the entire shape? Or not? Am I looking at multiple different kinds of textures, multiple different stitch types, or different stitch angles, which leads me to believe that though I'm looking at a shape, a skull, a sprocket, a horse head, a butterfly, whatever it is, that if I see different types, even if I'm in the same color, people look at color for the breaks. Even in the same color, I can tell that I'm drawing different shapes. I might be layering them or repeating them depending on what's layered on top of each other. I might also run one color more than once in the sequence. We look at all these things together and it helps us understand how we're breaking design and what it means, what it looks like. And there's certainly things we can talk about with materials and texture and all the rest of it. But I think it's fairly easy to see how we start to get more out of the designs we're looking at, out of examining our samples, if we start trying to take all these things into account. And sometimes it's little touches that let us know that things aren't what they might seem to be. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this one up. And some of these are the big wall of shame. They're actually kind of rejects and test samples that were on the old shop wall from one of the shops that I was in. And so these are my pieces. I get to at least tear them up. If I'm going to criticize them, I can criticize my own. But they were literally stapled to the wall. So this is what my operators did. I just want to go ahead and save myself by saying I never did this. I didn't staple these to the wall. These were my operators who like to do this. But we're looking at this piece from the Department of the Interior. It's not the best lighting, so you'll have to forgive me. But we can still see some things about my little buffalo and my Department of the Interior badge that was done here. And I actually was copying from an original piece, and there's something that's interesting about that. So though we have a fairly common, standard kind of way that we've dealt with this, I've used a curved fill in the back of this bison. You can see because I've got this nominal curve that's pretty easy to see. We have a regular pattern, so it's easy to tell that this is a fill stitch because that pattern stays regular. It's not randomized, so it's a fairly default fill, but it does have a curve to it. We can see that I split off and drew separate shapes for each of the legs. How can I tell? I've got a turning satin stitch that doesn't line up with the end of the fill, and I have a nice little shadow here showing you that the body is actually on top of the leg. There we are. You can see that I've got some manually drawn straight stitch elements that are on top of this to shade. How can I tell they're manually drawn? They're not regular. At no point does this look like a fill. This is not spaced regularly. I actually have some different lengths as well going on in here. Some of that randomization is because I am dropping individual points as I draw that are going to force a needle penetration, but you can tell they're not regular. It's not me putting another fill layer on top of this. It's me drawing individual lines on top of it to create some texture and some detail. Satin stitch horns, easy to tell. Like I said, lighting's not great, so you can't see as much of the contrast as I'd love you to see. But there are some other things that are interesting in this piece, despite the fact that it's kind of a rough sample. We can tell that we have a single angle of fill for most of these background mountains. Once again, copying an original, I did take some liberties with the animal because I couldn't help but do a little bit of carving in the legs and make it look a little nicer. But the other thing that I think is very interesting with this piece is this little sunburst up here, which some people would say, oh, that was done in some sort of weird, it's like some sort of weird gradient. If you zoom out from it, you're like, what is that gradient? Is that done with a certain kind of thread? What's being done here? What stitch type is that? Is that satins? And in this case, I'm going to zoom in so you can tell that it's not actually satins, even though it looks like it. In this case, this piece was not done with satins. It was actually done with straight stitches, treated very much like manual stitches. So this is another one of the weird ones. How can I tell this is not done with little satin blocks? If it were done with little satin blocks, we wouldn't see this variation in here where these stitches sometimes don't land, the penetration points don't land in the same place. If each one of these colors was a satin stitch block, it would be regular. The likelihood is, unless I did some sort of post editing to it, we would see a smooth satin stitch block in each one of these areas that connected up. And so each one of the colors would have one satin block. In this case, you can see both that I did do a little bit of kind of pseudo silk shading, meaning that I interleaved the two colors in each piece because you can see some of the red trails up into the orange, some of the orange trails up into the yellow. And you can see that there are stitch penetration points that don't make sense for a satin stitch. These were done manually by drawing back and forth and understanding how far apart my lines were to get my coverage. This stands out in the rest of this piece. The other thing I'm going to say is when we zoom out from this piece, if you're looking at this piece, all of you who've done any number of embroidered pieces or seen a lot of embroidery in your lifetimes are going to look at this and go, regular, regular, regular. This is all stitch types, and go, what the heck is this up here? Because this does not look like fills, satins, and straights used in a standard manner. This little area will stick out. And it did to me when I was looking at the original patch they were working from. Though I took some liberties in here and did some cool carving and stuff in the actual piece that's in the buffalo. Like I said, I look at the, or in the bison, in this color scheme, I don't love it. It looks a little rough in this lighting, but nice little piece, has some curve to it, some dimension to the back, has some dimension to the legs. Immediately, I did, however, track that in the original patches I was being shown, we had some very interesting use of straight stitches or manual stitches on this old school patch to create this piece up here. So when I was copying the original piece that I had, or at least taking inspiration from it, from that original piece, I did decide I'm going to render it very similarly to this. So I do have these really deep furrows. What is this? I am allowing my penetration points to line up, but it's being done manually. It's not literally a satin, even though you could be forgiven for thinking this is layers of satin stitch. How can we tell it's not? Obviously, they're not regular like satin. The bars don't stay exactly right. If we looked at just this piece, you might be forgiven for thinking it's there, but then we can see how we have some layers that are interleaved, and you can see that there are some penetration points that don't make sense for a satin column up here. So with that, we can tell that that's more of a manual stitch. What did we look for that told us that stuff? Well, we looked for repetition, we looked for regularity, we looked for texture, and we understand what standard stitch types look like. When we understand what the standard stitch type looks like, we have a chance at knowing when we've deviated from the standard stitch type. That's part of it. We have to understand what stitch types look like to know when we deviated. I'm going to bring up another, and once again, little reject sample. So this is one of the random reject samples they had stapled up. Certainly, like I said, I'm showing you the not cleaned up versions of these. So you'll see some flaws and some things in these that are not perfect. But this is one that I did for the village of Los Lunas. It actually got repaired because this text did not look the best. This 1928 fell apart a little bit in the font that they chose. But hey, the cool things we can look at on this that I want to make clear is what was done as far as this shading here. Very light amount of shading that's done, and people will say, all right, that's a kind of a weird gradient, and it does have a pretty harsh texture here that goes right into that blue. I will fully agree with you. This was not done to be incredibly smooth, and wasn't particularly incredibly smooth in the original. I would also argue that you'd want the blue and the white to be closer together in the final piece, and I believe that blue was changed to more of a sky blue in the final piece, despite the original protestations of the design folks. We went ahead and changed that blue. But what I am going to say is we can tell how this was done. Whereas a lot of my blending was done manually, this is light enough and didn't add enough density to the final piece that I used just a layer of accordion fill. So an accordion fill is a fill stitch that, like an accordion fold, it starts out at one density and it keeps on going like a normal gradient fill or an accordion fill would in any other software. It goes from a tighter spacing to a further spacing out. However, it happens in small increments along the entirety of the fill. How can we tell that this is an accordion fill and not done manually? Number one, if you're doing it manually, it would be cleaner, but you would see the steps. You would see uh, going from different ratios, 1 to 3 to half and half to 3 to 1. You would see the steps in ratios if somebody was doing layers of loose fill on top of each other. In this case, it's fairly obvious that I've got white laying down first. Also, how can I tell? Because I've got a little blank area where we don't have that fill inside of this area. And you can see that the connecting stitches around the outside edge, traveling the edge or trapunto style or travel edge style on this fill actually is on top of the white behind it. So the white is in the background. In this case, the blue is on top. It also tells you that this white that's in the satin edge on this house, on this very small piece, um, must be on top of everything because it goes on top of the blue that's in the fill. So we can tell that we ran the white at least twice because of layering, right? But in this case, how can I tell it's an accordion fill? It's very regular. It's drawn in one big shape. I can tell that I've traveled an edge. I have a cutout here that allows for this area not to have any of the shading inside of it. And we have a very gradual, very regular mechanical spacing where it gets just a little bit bigger every so often, every little bit along that gradient from the top to the bottom. This is done mechanically. This is done with a single accordion fill stitch or gradient fill stitch rather than being done manually or through multiple layers of lighter density fills. Is it the best solution for this? Maybe not. If we were replicating it, that's what we would want to do to replicate the piece. The eventual piece was fairly successful, looked pretty good. The little house looked nice enough. I would say most of the pieces that are in there are interesting. We can also see that we've got couple different colors of gold for the shading in here on the little yellow house that's there. It's nice, no problems there. You can tell that we have a couple other interesting things to kind of remark on in the piece is that we do have these multiple satin stitch layers being used for the train tracks. However, what I'm going to show you is that the inner layer here that's underneath these train tracks is one solid piece with an automatic length limit or split satin here. How can we tell? Because we're following this same angle throughout the white that's underneath the train tracks. And as we get to a wider setting, we can tell that after a certain point, it was allowed to split automatically because I can see these stitch penetration points in the center and they're offset automatically. So the likelihood is either a length limit setting or an automatic split. So these are the things we can see from looking at texture, stitch type, stitch angle, and especially the regularity of things like stitch penetration points. Um, Very briefly, I'll go ahead and talk about something that is not embroidery that comes up a lot. And this is one that I just, it's interesting every time it comes up. There's always someone who goes, man, I saw a patch had incredibly tiny embroidered detail. You're always telling me you can only get down to, 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter text, even with really tiny thread. How the heck does this have this crazy detail? And then they send me something like this happy little motorhead patch here. So for all of you guys who don't know, I'm just going to say this ahead of time. Does this look like embroidery to you? No, this is not embroidery. If you see something like this with little teeny tiny text, yes, it is made of threads. It looks very much like it might be something semi embroidered. This is a woven patch. For those of you who know, this is no new news. This is nothing incredible to you, but it's worth kind of bringing up because lots of people will talk about this. I'll see, and actually, I'll say that one of the times this came up in this last week is actually more than once. But one of the times was on the Discord for the embroidery nerd guys. Somebody said, "Hey, how do I digitize this star in a patch?" It was Matt said, "How do I digitize this star in a patch?" Everybody started giving tips on how to embroider the star. But if you looked at it closely, the tiny stars were actually on a woven patch. And the reason why they're so tiny and have such tight detail is that woven materials like this have these incredibly small threads that are woven in and out of the machine. They are not embroidered. It's not multiple layers. The colors are woven either to the front or the back of the patch of this stack of material, and they are woven in place. So they have incredibly fine detail, and it's something that is actually done on a very different machine. So this is, and that's the thing. Ramona says that is ink, and I'm going to say nope, not in this case. In this case, if we look at it closely, this one is actually woven. And woven patches, if you've ever seen a stock standard woven label in your shirt, if you're not familiar with woven patches, that's a place where a lot of people see them. Little tiny text, it's woven. How can we tell the things, the hallmarks of something that's woven? When you see thread like textures in these pieces, all of the angles, they're horizontal. Horizontal or vertical, they're all on one angle. Usually it's horizontal, sometimes it's all vertical, depending on the art. I haven't seen them on any other angle, but as you see, there's this very distinct stair stepping as these curves get flatter up here into the top of this helmet. We're actually seeing a very distinct kind of stair stepping angle. All of these fill stitch like places that we see in here, these penetration points, it's not penetration points, it's woven. So this is woven in place. And in this case, we'll see these very small lines that are there that are detailed. We can get this fine detail, but as you can see, when we get up into the top of these flat areas in the curve where we start to approach the horizontal, the lines get longer, the details get stair-stepped, and it almost looks like pixel art. This is endemic of a woven patch. And if we look down here at the bottom, this is a Motorhead patch, and it's a commercial patch. This was done here in 2017. You can see that this text looks very pixel-like, and all of the lines are actually horizontal in the thread. Because the weave of this piece, the color is weaving in and out of the layers horizontally. All of those color layers are either diving to the forefront or dipping underneath on that angle. So the woven patches have incredibly small detail. This is not something you're replicating in embroidery. It is not made like embroidery. It's made on a piece that or on a machine that weaves the patch, weaves the cloth that has this design in it. So woven patches where we get a lot of these little tiny details. A lot of people think it's embroidered. You can be forgiven for saying it looks like it's a fill stitch almost throughout the patch, but pieces like this with incredibly fine details, they are flat though. There's no layering, especially if you have one in your hands. They are smooth, they are flat to the touch. Sometimes you will see, and actually Ramona is right that sometimes when people show a patch and it actually is ink. A lot of sublimation patches are out there too. In this case though, it is a woven patch that then has a marrowed edge applied to it. So it has been marrowed, and you can see how it's manually marrowed. It's got that lovely tail marker where we come back around the circle and the tail is tucked under the bottom side. That irregularity down there tells you it was manually marrowed on a marrow machine. But this patch is made woven in place on a like on a machine that weaves the patch, the material, whole cloth, literally. So this is a woven patch. It is not an embroidered piece. Frequently when people say, yup, I saw a small detail, it can be done embroidered. Yes, it's made out of thread. It looks like it's thread because we're weaving a piece of material out of thread. So here is another woven patch. Once again, we zoom out from it. We're like, wow, there's a lot of fine detail in it. When you zoom in close, you can see how anytime we're on an angle or on a curve, because we only have that horizontal, as we get into these flat curves, if it's either horizontal or vertical or on some sort of set angle, we get this very distinct stair stepping, and things are flat. There are no variations in stitch angle, so you don't get that shine or reflection off of this weave. There's not going to be a difference between one block of this weave to the other. They do have the ability to use metallic fibers, so you will find uh, woven patches that have a metallic component to them. They are often multiple colors. They can often achieve very fine blending because these are much thinner threads that are used to weave the patch than we use in embroidery. But the case is that though there's some fine detail, it still does have some weaknesses in the fact that you don't get a lot of cleanliness in the curves. because we are absolutely stuck with the fact that we are weaving on that one angle. So woven patches, they're very cool. From a distance, they look very fine. You can get incredibly small detail like this little tiny text and the small fine details that are inside of this, the helmet and the teeth that are on the motorhead patch. So a lot of people love woven patches. They're becoming more popular as some of the minimums go down when you order these from emblem companies. But generally, they're going to be done by people at emblem companies who have these setups. This is a fairly big commercial setup. It's not something you're going to see made at home, and you are certainly not going to be finding this coming off of your embroidery machine. Whereas, hey, pieces like this, very interesting texture, but very obviously embroidered. And we can tell because the rest of this, we have this embroidered edge that's on here. This was cut after the fact, so either hot cut or post cut, because we can see a little bit. And I would say this probably cut with a hot knife because we have a little melted edge that is on the outside of this patch after it was made. So it was run, it was just created in a span. So an entire span of material was hooped, it was stitched, and when the thing was taken out, we cut it with a hot knife, which is like a wood burning pen, and traced the outside edge fairly obviously from looking at it, right? We can tell that's what's going on here. But this was done on a standard embroidery machine. None of these stitches are impossible for the machine, right? Some of the other things we might see, if you're looking at things that look like chenille, they have chenille loops that are literally standing forward from the machine. They look like toweling, but it is not an applied piece of material. Then it's not made on an embroidery machine either. If it's a classic letter jacket style chenille patch, that's made on a chenille machine, and the chenille machine pulls loops of thread. The spools of thread are actually under the bed of the machine, under the workpiece, and the loops are pulled up. And that's something that our standard embroidery machines can't do without approximating it through the use of support materials or other kinds of materials to hold up the loops. It's actually done on a specific kind of machine. So woven patches and chenille patches, those are not done on the machine. That's why we're doing things, and we see cool people like Vitor and like, hey, Justin does some, I've done some. People making textured pieces like I just showed you earlier, and like the piece that we saw here that emulate things like chain stitch, which has real loops. That also comes off of a chenille machine. Chenille machine, chain stitch machine, same thing. Just does different things to create the loops. And if we have real loops of thread, we have actual tied loops or woven chains like that. Those are done on a chenille machine or a chain stitch machine. They're not done on a standard embroidery machine. How can we tell? If you ever see that the loop is not connected to something else by a travel stitch, we can only work on the face of our designs because we have running at the same time, we have the top thread and the bottom thread. And unless we tie off and trim, we can't run underneath a design. So it's either handwork. Sometimes I've seen people ask me how handwork is done on a machine, and it's not. It's handwork that's being done where someone is being able to literally move a needle above or below the piece. Or we're seeing something like a chenille machine or a chain stitch machine. Well, the same machine. We're seeing chenille or chain stitch machine, and it is literally pulling loops up from underneath the workpiece, and that's what's laying on top of the design. That's also what's standing up above the design, what's making an actual pile of loops. And that is not a standard embroidery machine. So some of those things can't happen. So letter jacket patches, those are real chenille. Those are made on a particular machine. Can you do that yourself as a commercial embroiderer? You can if you buy a chenille machine and learn to digitize for chenille with chenille specific software. But it's not the same thing as what we're doing with our traditional embroidery. Whereas stuff like I showed you just a moment ago, the textures that we have from Sebastian that I showed, or even this texture that was that actually I don't know who the creator is on this one, that was offered up by one of our users of the Stitch Artist group as something they were trying to emulate. These were done on traditional interlock embroidery machines, and they were worked in a fun motif that approximates something that looks like the old school chain stitch fills or chenille type fills that are available with using different equipment, different machinery. Now, there's other things like that that we can talk about. You can get different textures that don't look very common to regular machine embroidery. I mean, this is a piece that I did, and I've showed you guys this one before. This one looks very old school and looks like it might be made on a weird machine. But if we look at it closely, the things I'm going to call out are the fact that, number one, though there's a material difference, I am using an interesting material. It's a fuzzy thread. This is only a spun polyester thread. It's not something very different. The loops are not standing very far above the surface, so not like a chenilling machine. You can tell that these are all connected. And if we look very closely, very classic back stitch like motif going along the outside edges. So what is this piece actually made out of? If we look at our central seam here, we have something that looks like a split satin, but if we look closely at it, there's no split, there's no show through here. So it's two layers, overlapped satin stitches that are used with a whip stitch. You whip stitch or a multi-count satin layered together with another outer border of backstitch drawn around the outside edge. And how would you tell that sort of stuff? Well, we're going to look at the piece, and I'm actually going to bring this up and say this is how we can tell whip stitches or a multi-count satin stitch. If we look at a design, if we zoom in on a piece, as we get tight to the piece, oh, pardon me, we can see that we have multiple passes of thread that are thin in the same stitch penetration point. So though this looks like big thick stitches, obviously it's almost like a bean stitch would be, multiple passes of thread, of thin thread in the same stitch penetration points. And when we look between them, there is a single pass, a connector stitch that is the thickness of the single width of thread. That's showing you that this is a digitizing trick. These are the same shapes that I'm applying different stitch settings to. In this case, a whip stitch or a multi-pass satin stitch, where each of the perpendicular passes has multiple passes of thread on each one. The interesting thing about this particular piece, there's the same stitch count on each one of these R's. It's just that they are grouped differently by using that multi-count, multi-pass, or whip stitch satin stitch setting. And if we look at the roughness that's on this, we have this very kind of randomized roughness. You could draw that in if you wanted to, but in this case, I'm using feathering or jagged edge on both edges of this satin stitch. So this is still a satin stitch block, and we can tell that it's put together very much like a standard letter because of how we have the different angles to each block. The thing is, if you were grabbing this piece and you wanted to replicate it, you wouldn't grab a True Tape R, slap it on there, and just apply a setting. You're going to have multiple blocks. In this case, there is the bottom serif foot here, this central spine, the curve on the top, and then we're finishing the top layer being the right hand leg out toward the right side. So this R is made up of 4 blocks, and we all know that from looking at keyboard lettering, native lettering that comes in our software. If we look at a piece like this top left, we understand that. That's what that looks like. What we have to realize is just the way the letter is made up of multiple pieces, so is the skull. So is the logo. So is this horse. It's made up of multiple drawn pieces, even if, when I look at the original art, the entire body of this horse is one piece. In order to get a variation of texture, stitch type, stitch angle, I'm drawing multiple blocks to make that happen. Or in the case of a piece like this, I may be, I don't know for sure on how this piece was created, I may be drawing my own spiral pathway to fill this area using an automated spiral fill either in my vector software or in my embroidery software, or doing something like we see in the other piece here where I'm using a stipple fill and then I'm applying a custom motif to that pathway to fill the area. There are multiple ways we can do it, but we can tell when we're looking at these two pieces here, this is not a standard satin stitch. This is not a standard fill stitch. This was not applied the way the body of this horse was in a couple of pieces. These are applied in a different method. We can tell that because of that contrast of the stitch angles, the randomness or regularity of the pieces that are there, and the fact that we see these patterns. And when we zoom out from it, you can actually see that ripple, that kind of spiral a little more clearly. The contours become more clear. And sometimes you got to just squint at the design and look at it and say, how is this broken apart? And does it make sense that this was done in a way that's either manual or automatic? And can I explain it? We'll go ahead and look at another simple piece here. This is another piece of mine. This was done for mud volleyball, one of my older samples, but I like this piece. As we can see, if we looked at the original art, the chances are this mud was all one big block of, kind of reddish brown mud on the design, right? We did have an outline, a border of a different color, but the rest of this area, the mud was all in one big piece. If we're looking at it though on this piece, we can already tell, all right, well, I've got some different stitch types here. So the chances are this is not drawn in one piece. It's not one block that I've converted with a magical stitch type that does this stuff automatically. I drew multiple pieces within the mud block, this area, to create the pieces that I needed. I've got a lovely satin stitch drop here. This drip that's sticking up is all one satin, so it's likely that this piece was done in one piece. Might be first, might be last. I can't see the travel stitches that are going from that might be going underneath this outer border, but that also doesn't matter to me recreating it then. But what I can tell is if I want this look, I've got this fairly regular piece down here, but it's got some randomization to it. It looks to me like I have a curved fill. That curve stays pretty uniform, but that I'm using a random setting for stitch length, which is why these don't line up exactly perfectly. I've got some randomness, some roughness, some organic nature to the curved fill that's underneath here. But I then look at this satin stitch, one big satin, so that's one block, probably two blocks here. Then I look at these three droplets, and I have these three little columns here where I've got texture and these nice little shadows that are not exactly regular. It looks to me, because of which one's on top, the center one is on top, the likelihood is each one of these satins was stitched individually, one here, left hand side, one on the right hand side, and then the central rib was stitched on top of both with a little bit of overlap so that there's no gaps or show through. So already we've got four blocks. We have the block here that was drawn, one object drawn for the fill, one object for this droplet, three objects for these satin stitches. They're not just a split satin. It's not automatic, and you can see some individual curvature here. Also, it's not just a cut line. It's not just a place where we're dropping a point where inside of this satin stitch I have a custom carving line. How can I tell that? There's no show through of the background material, which often happens when we just use penetration points, and it's got a real thick kind of buildup here. That buildup is the two layers of satin stitch laying on top of each other. Then I have each of the interior fills of these droplets. They're probably, because I have a full coverage of the border, the likelihood is I didn't stitch underneath that. So I probably traveled out to each one of those and put a satin stitch in each one of these. So this mud just inside of this blob is at least 7 pieces, right? The big fill piece here, this droplet on the side, each one of the three that are in this column, and those are made into carved columns so that it makes sense that they're spraying apart into these three droplets. And those three droplets make the last three of the 7 pieces that I drew in order to represent this blob as something more than a fill stitch blob that goes from one corner out to the other side. The texture is all based on the fact that I've used different stitch types and different stitch angles. Now, these angles are pretty close between these satins that are in this column, but as you can see up here in the different droplets, we actually have slightly different stitch angles so that as the light passes over them, we get a different kind of color, a different kind of shine and shadow for each one of the drops. So this is one of the problems. Somebody will bring a piece to me like this and go, how did they make this mud thing? What stitch type do I choose to make this one object look like this? Well, you have at least 2 stitch types, you have at least 7 blocks that were drawn, 7 shapes that were drawn to make this piece. There is no stitch type we can select that is going to make this an exact piece like this. Could we get closer? Sure. Sure, we could. We could use this fill stitch that had a very large minimum stitch size, and then all around the outer border, the outer edge, or if we had padding, depending on how your software calls it, we would have this kind of satin-like edge around the whole thing because the whole thing has to have that edge. And then as we got into this little area here, we'd have a nice satin-like border on both sides. It would make an interesting texture, but it wouldn't look like this. You want something like this where we have a difference in the stitch angles that is pretty I wouldn't say it's a strong difference, but it's not a crazy difference. But we do have a difference in the stitch angles from the curvature up into the splash, and definitely that we have a texture in this ribbed kind of multi-layered satin, this ribbed satin texture that's in here that makes it look like those droplets are flying apart. That's going to be had by drawing multiple shapes. So in this case, when we're looking at that piece, it's really all about parsing and shape. But still, we're looking at the same stuff though. What do we notice? Stitch types and where they change. What do we notice? Stitch angles and where they change. What do we notice? Stitch lengths and if they are regular or not, and if there's some repetition or regularity, or if there's some roughness there. We're noticing texture. And then once again, if we're going to look at spacing or density, in this case, I don't see a lot of show through. If I don't see a lot of show through and I can tell that this thickness of this thread looks pretty standard, it looks like 40 weight thread, then the likelihood is this is right around in that 0.4 to 0.45 range, depending on color contrast. You could probably go a little lighter because this is brown on khaki. You're going to get something that would probably be okay, but I can tell that we got a lot of solid coverage in this piece. Chances are we're in that 0.4 to 0.45 range that is fairly standard for satin and fill stitches in 40 weight thread. Very likely. Also, in this case, I can see this looks like standard embroidery thread. Nothing's fuzzy. Nothing is rough. Nothing is matte. This is shiny. It has a shadow on it. Even looking at this image, not seeing it in person, I can tell by the sheen that this is standard, either polyester or rayon. And I would say I can tell that this looks like polyester to me. And in this case, I will let you know this was done in isocord polyester, which has a different sheen to it than, say, like a Madeira poly neon, which tends to be a little more rayon like and a little shinier. But how do I know that stuff? Because I've looked at a lot of embroidery, I've looked at a lot of thread. And that's part of the thing. It's easy for me to just say to you, this is easy stuff to tell. You look at it and you can tell. Of course, it is for somebody like me who's spent 20 years of their life looking at embroidery. If you're just starting out in this, you shouldn't feel bad that maybe this doesn't feel as obvious to you as it does to me or to some other expert or know it all in any one of your embroidery groups who tells you, dude, how do you not know that this is this kind of thing? Same thing with the woven patch. You can totally be forgiven for thinking that that woven patch we looked at looked like embroidery. It's thread. It looks like thread. It has texture. It looks like stitches. You can see some show through in this area that they filled in these banners. You can be forgiven immediately by for thinking that that looks like embroidery. It does. To an untrained eye, it looks like embroidery. After some exposure to more embroidery and woven patches, and if you look these up online, literally in Google image search and check them out, you'll be able to tell the difference between them and you'll see those hallmarks and you'll be able to see the things that make it interesting. Now, I'm going to show you just a few different random things that I have for photos. I actually pulled some of these other pieces up for design analysis. Like I said, I showed you guys this texture piece before, but there's other things we can talk about where you can tell some of this interesting stuff that's out here. Like I said, it's about knowing these different settings, about understanding embroidery and the materials that'll help you figure stuff out. But like, there's another piece of mine that I wanted to bring up. Somebody will ask me, hey, how did you achieve this one? In this case, definitely a machine done. You know it is. Number one, how can I tell? I've got a very regular satin stitch that's very obviously a satin stitch border in here. Yes, is there some difference to the fiber? Yeah, this is done with a spun polyester. It's fuzzy. The fiber is not super shiny. It's not exactly matte finish either, so it's not a matte finish poly. It's a spun polyester fiber. Not doesn't look really fuzzy like cotton either, but it is a lot fuzzier than standard embroidery thread. If we look at it closer, though, we've got a very, very regular pattern. There's no variation to it. Every cross stitch is exactly the same size, exactly the same thickness on each pass. It's a machine made cross stitch. Everything is connected. There's no jump stitches or issues with that. But at the same time, everything's worked on the top surface. How is this made? Either through using a cross stitch fill or a cross stitch specific software. If it's not cross stitch specific, it's definitely done with a cross stitch filled area. But we can tell that by looking at what pieces are there. And honestly, in any of our pieces, we have that possibility. If we look at a piece like this is one of the pieces I did for Q104. So it's a raised material. I do have a wash away raised material that raised the thread that's in the ohm in the center. But if we look at the rest of it, the leaves and the lotus, you can see that we have an automated contour. How can I tell? It's not set densities. What we have is when the design is wider, when any one of these leaves or petals is wider, density gets lower. At the tips, it gets tighter. That's a very standard contour fill. You'll know this by checking out any one of your satin or column tools and applying a contour stitch type to it. The density gets tighter as the stitches get closer. In Stitch Artist, it's a contour 1. Depending on which software you have, it's a standard contour. But we can see that we have that same very mechanical distance, that it is very regular. The spacing is very regular. It's not manual, and it's not spiral because it doesn't spiral out and it doesn't have any transverse pieces. It is just along the contour of the design, and we don't see any other connectors or any other travel that's perpendicular to the edges of these leaves as we go through. How would we know that? Well, we start to learn the way that these contour stitches look, and we show those to each other. We can see what that looks like by comparing what's happening in the design to what's happening in the final piece. And I'm going to go ahead and bring a couple more pieces up here. One of the pieces people have bought frequently from my The Only Stitch site, and I'll show you that in a second, is this, which is a ostrich feather. Another one of those things where we can tell immediately what we're looking at. If we look at each piece that's on here, we can talk about motif stitches. Here we have motif stitches along a path. How can I tell? Very regular repetition, a repetitive pattern following a single central line that's drawn on there. It is the hallmark of a motif run. a copied set of stitches that is repeated along a line. Now, it does have a central set of straight stitches in the center, and we can tell because we have this little straight stitch end that sticks out beyond these edges. Otherwise, we have this repetitive group that is along a line, and these are feather stitches. Very traditional type of hand stitching, but it repeats along a course, along a line, along a curve, a path. When we get further up into the rest of the design, we'll zoom in, we can see that we switch on these lines as they start to get thinner. Instead of having this motif, this feather style motif that repeats along a path, we still have stitching along a central path, but this central path has what we call back stitching. In our software, we'll see this back stitching has this little backward cross that goes back up and it gets thicker, and we can adjust the angle it lays to the main column. So we go into back stitching as we go further up into the design. And as we get to the thinnest lines that are there, these are very obviously straight stitches. How can we tell they're straight stitches and not bean stitches? Even though these line up, bean stitches are tend to be in multiples of an odd multiples, and they're usually a multiple of 3 to start, because a bean stitch is made to start at one end and continue on the design, and unless you're going odd numbers of stitches, you're not moving forward. As you can see with each of these, if we zoom in on them, there are 2 passes of thread, one pass out to the end, one pass back. And if I'm looking at this image, I can literally count that I've got 2 threads laying next to each other. That tells me that this piece was done by drawing a line out to the end of each one of these lines and back to the original piece. If we look at the piece in here, believe it or not, we can tell that we have a jagged fill for this. How do we tell that it's a tatami or a fill stitch? Because we have some very regular penetration points. This is harder to tell, but we have light density fills that are layered together. And in the center, we have a light density curved fill that's in the center. These are harder to tell because we've got these multiple colors of fill that are layered together. You might have to play with your settings. But when we see regularity in our stitch patterns or our stitch penetration points, we can tell that it's possible that we've used something like a radial fill that's light density. How do we tell it's light density? It shows through. We can see the background behind things. And when there are multiple layers together, the layers aren't causing a bunch of built up texture. And we see one color through the other color. So we know we're dealing with light layers, probably half density or less, half of a full coverage density or less, layered together in order to get these multiple colors. This can get a little harder to tell, but I can tell it's not manual because we can see that there's a very regular angle as I turn around the opposite edge. Could it be manually dropped? Yes. Likelihood is most digitizers who want to save a little time are going to be using some sort of automatic fill to make that happen. Like I said, I could go on and do this for a million designs, and I think I might come back and do more of this stuff later to show you guys. Here's another one that I think is interesting. Once again, those contours. Here's our contour fills. We have those. They do that same little trick I showed you before, where as a satin column or as a column gets thicker, the density gets wider, the spacing between the courses get wider. As it gets thinner, it gets tighter and more dense. Absolutely the hallmark of a column fill. And we can see that there is a curved fill that's up here at the top of the final flower too. If we look at the top of the floret, we will see that there is a light density. It's got show through, curved fill making up this top petal. So we have contour columns. So they are thin columns, ribbon-like shapes that have those contour fills. We have a standard light density satin in these 2 pieces here. We can tell that because it looks like a satin. It's got those perpendicular stitches that go across the column. And then we can see we have a light density fill stitch. It's got regular penetration points. You see these little angled lines that are appearing in it. That is a curved fill on the top of this piece. Once we learn what these stitch types look like, we can see them over and over. Like I said, at some point, we'll do more of this design analysis. I know you guys, sometimes when I show this stuff, people like to watch the live design analysis. It's something we can do over and over again, but I think we can go ahead and call that here. We're going to let that be enough. I might grab a couple comments if we've got some more comments to talk about, but I just want to make it clear that this is stuff we can all learn, but it takes us spending some time to familiarize ourselves with stitch types, and it takes us looking at a lot of embroidery, honestly, looking at a lot of embroidery, looking at stitches, looking at designs. And if we're doing the best version of the work we can, running some designs ourselves in different threads on different materials and seeing how they react, not only to see how overlap and underlay and all of those things work in a technical way, but to see how different types of stitch patterns on screen, different stitch types that are used in the software look in the real world in the thread. When we do that, we can start to work backward from the thread samples and work through that. And actually, like I showed on my earlier episode about non-standard tools you might have, Also, there's nothing wrong if you're the kind of person who needs to see something real close, get yourself a magnifier. They are of different levels of expense. This is a very nice one that I received as a present. So thank you, Brian Bailey, who decided to get me a new one. I have a cheap jeweler's loop I carry around, but also I've told you before, a flat bookmark magnifier is great for this stuff. To look closely at these things, to look closely at stitch angles, to look closely at the different things that you might have to see to tell what these things look like. Jeweler's loop is a great way to do it, especially a piece like this that is lit. It allows you to get close to it and, pardon me, it allows you to get close to it and have it lit so you can see the surface that's there and really look at the material in a close way to really analyze the stuff that we're looking at. So once again, I'll go over the kind of things we're looking for one more time. But this is the thing: when we're trying to see stitches and samples, when we're doing design analysis in the thread, we're looking for the kinds of things that are variables in our software. What variables do we have that we can assign to any shape? Certainly, those are the things like stitch type. Is it a regular fill? Is it on a broad area? Does it have a regular pattern to it, or maybe a slightly irregular pattern? But I can see that it's a pattern. What stitch type is there? What stitch angle is there? Are there different angles close to each other? That means I've got multiple different objects that might be parsed differently. What stitch lengths are there? Are they longer or shorter? And does that make it look a little more pebbly or rough, or does it make it look a little longer and smoother? And then from that, we can help ourselves understanding how the shapes were drawn. How is it parsed? Yes, there may be one leaf here, but is the leaf made of two leaflets or two pieces? Is the stem done a different way? As in that mud splash, do I have multiple droplets or columns of material that are called out in different stitch types or stitch angles that lets you know that I had to draw different vector-like objects, different embroidery objects to get those pieces together, and did I overlap them? Are there paths that I can see? Do I see spirals or paths that are filling an area? Or do I see that there's an outline that follows a particular path? And it's obvious to me that this is not something that's irregular on both sides, but that I have some sort of fairly regular pattern or something that's repetitive that's following a line that I can see, a path. We look for layering. What's on top of something else, and how does that change our understanding of where colors run in the design and where we might have different objects that are on top of each other to prevent show through, to provide some other sort of look, some other sort of artistic layering or texture. Repetition. Do I see a group of stitches that repeats in multiple places? If it does it regularly, marching back and forth across an entire shape, it's probably a motif fill. If it does it along a path, whether that's along a border or in a spiral that fills a shape, that's probably a motif run or a spiral fill on top of which has been placed a motif run. These are things we look at that repetition to tell us. We look at textures. If the texture is regular or rough, it may be that there's manual stitches or a manual grouping of stitches or a motif if there are rough textures that don't look like the standard stitch types that we know and love. And we look at things like spacing. How much can I see? How much show through is there? What kind of density is there to it? Can I see material through it? Can I see another color through it? Is it looser than full density, which would obscure everything behind it? Then we look at some other stuff too, certainly materials. Is this a fuzzy thread or a thick thread? Or am I seeing multiple passes of a thinner thread? Do I see the single connector that lets me know that though I look like I have big, thick stitches, those are actual multiple passes of a thinner thread along the same line to produce something that looks like a thick stitch? And also things like sheen. Is this a spun polyester with a little bit of fuzz, or is it very fuzzy like a wool blend thread? And is that part of what's making the design look the way it looks? Is it not the digitizing so much as along this path? It's not multiple passes, it's a big thick thread, and that's what I need to do to make this thing look the right way. And what kind of fibers are used? Is it really fuzzy and natural fiber, or can I tell that it's kind of shiny? Can I tell that it's a little fuzzy but not fully matte finish or fully shiny like the matte poly or the standard polyester would be or the rayon would be? These are things we can talk about with materials. When we're looking at design, when we're looking at digitizing, a lot of it is how do we draw those shapes? What stitch types are filling each of these shapes up? What stitch angles are we using? What different lengths are possible, or what regularity do we see? And is there something like repetition on a path, or do we have other kinds of ways that we're filling a space that are not standard stitch types? All right. So with that, I think we are well past bonus time. And what I would love to say is, guys, the best thing you can do for yourself to really get this is go look at some embroidery, search for cool embroidery that you see online, check out stuff that is in the category you want to do. Let's say you're going to digitize your first ever thing, you're digitizing a mascot. Go look up a bunch of mascots and zoom in on them. Look at the stitch types that are available in other people's work. It doesn't mean their work is perfect or you should emulate everything they do, but it does give you hints to what they do. Just make sure that you respect their work, that you respect their time, you respect the things that they've created, and make sure you're getting inspiration, not just knocking things off. Unless you've been, have a corporate entity that's having you specifically reproduce a piece, don't just knock it off. Make something that's inspired and learn from the things that you can as far as how they break things apart, how they use their stitch types, how they use your textures, and make sure to credit the folks who you are working from. But yeah, like I said, there's all these things we can learn from. Go out and learn, look up the categories that are there, and get into your software and play, right? Get into your software and play, learn how stitch types look, and make the jump from the file to the machine, even if you're making blocks of swatches of stitches, even if you're making something simple just to test. It only has to be for you. But until thread, needle, and fabric meet, you really don't know what you've got on your files. Get out there and play, consume a lot, consume broadly, create with focus, and I cannot wait to have you guys back again and send me some of those samples. Send me some stuff that we got from Sebastian Vasquez. Send me some stuff and show me so I can share with everybody next Friday.